Again.
That's where she should be.
Yeah, we started the video again.
Did you find
Okay.
her?
Well, he's gonna go drive there.
That's where I saw her.
Okay, we're back. All right, excuse the thing. So, it is possible because of the earliest papyrus when it's written that Moses, when it talks about Moses writing things down, that he was writing things down in a papyrus, which would have been what he probably got from Egypt. And Moses would have the education and everything to be able to do that. So you'd have that part. Now, you go through all of that. The earliest version of Hebrew language that we have doesn't date until about 1200 BC, which would put it after the time of Judges. The earliest form of Hebrew that we have isn't until after Judges. Now, in Hebrew, the earliest manuscripts that we have that date much later, the Hebrew is what's called Old Hebrew. Old Hebrew doesn't have any vowels, and it doesn't have any spaces between words or anything. Isn't that nice?
It's been very difficult for me.
Okay, so that's the beginning of going from the cuneiform to Hebrew, a written language. And it literally does come from the cuneiform and goes over. And so you get that development. Now, the first, do you know what vellum is?
Animal skin.
What?
Animal.
Animal hide. Yeah.
Nice.
And that's what that becomes better than papyrus, because papyrus is real weak. It's weaker than a piece of paper. It tears, it deteriorates real quickly. It's very vulnerable to everything. You get papyrus wet, forget it, it's useless. You know, but vellum, animal hide, and now that you really beat.
Yeah, Mom.
Really beat.
Vellum, you beat down, and that is the basis from which we actually get paper later. That becomes the precursor from paper, except they learn, instead of taking a poor animal and skinning it and everything, that you can do it with trees.
What were they using for ink?
They were using different pigments that you would get. And you're primarily from minerals and from the earth. And you grind it up, and then you can create different pigmentations of it, and you use it, and there's styluses.
Or we bleed our kids out.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah. So now, if you go through, so your first use of vellum isn't until after Israel falls from the Assyrians. And Judah falls to the Babylonians. Then you got the remnant of Israel returning around between 457 to 444 BC. The reason it's a broad date is, you know, the leaving to Babylon and the coming back from Babylon wasn't a one-stop thing. There were 3 exiles that occurred to Babylon, and there's 3 returns that occurred. You know, first Babylon surrounds Jerusalem, and the first Israel king says, okay, we give up, sure. And they take a few of them hostage, and they take them up, and they pay the Babylonians tribute. And then the king, after a few years, says, I don't like this, and he stops paying tribute, and the Babylonians come and beat him again. And They put a new person in as king, and they take a few more hostage. It's the second one. And then that king goes along, and then he says, oh, I had a heck of it. And he stops paying, and that's when the Babylonians say, fine, we'll just destroy you. And then they take the last group. Daniel actually goes in the first group.
In 586 BC?
Yeah, he leaves in the very first group. That's, well, 586 is when it totally falls.
So Daniel.
It's around,
Oh, 17.
it's around 575 that the first one happens. And they become, basically Judah becomes a vassal state of the Babylonians. So now our early, and then you go all that time, and it's around 332 BC that a guy named Alexander the Great comes along and conquers that whole region. And it's after him that we have our earliest manuscripts of a whole Old Testament books. And that's the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's what we call the Dead Sea Scrolls. Prior to that, all we had was little pieces. All we had were little fragments. The oldest piece we have is this little fragment from Deuteronomy. And if you take a look at your pictures, you know, you can see there the first writing from Sumna, pictograph. That's the earliest stone writing piece. And then underneath that, that's cuneiform. All that's done on stone. And then right there you have your earliest, the earliest papyrus piece. And notice it's just fragmentation of it. And it's just, that's just writing. It's nothing, it's not biblical writing, that's just writing, written language from Egypt on papyrus. And then on the back of that page, page 4 there, you'll see the oldest biblical manuscript fragment. It's an Exodus 9, Ashgar Gilson manuscript. And it's from what we would call Exodus 9. Of course, it doesn't have Exodus 9. They didn't have chapters. But when you translate it, it translates into what we call Exodus 9. And that's the earliest one. Okay?
And that's written on what?
And this, oh, that fragment, that's actually a vellum piece.
So I have a really dumb question.
No questions,
So,
no.
so if these are the only pieces that we have,
Until the Dead Sea Scrolls came around.
okay, so the Dead Sea Scrolls is where like Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus
Right.
came from. Okie dokie. Okay.
Well, but where we say, oh, here we got man, because prior to this, prior to the Dead Sea Scrolls being found, the earliest manuscript copies of complete books of the Bible and everything were around 300 to 400 AD. And all we had were these little fragments. And then, voila.
So they compared the fragments to what was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Well, the fragments were about the only thing, and they say, well, this is an indication that something exists, but we don't have a manuscript back then. We only have the complete manuscript up here. Then voila, with the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have these manuscripts from 300 BC. The manuscripts in the Dead Sea Scrolls range from about 350 BC all the way up to 100 AD.
And when do the Dead Sea Scrolls date from?
56.
Pardon me?
When do the Dead Sea Scrolls, what's their date?
They're dating from 350 BC all the way up to 100 AD. There's hundreds of scrolls. And they're not all about the Bible. Believe it or not, some are like cooking books.
Always recipes.
Yes.
When was Daniel, when did Daniel have his experience?
Daniel, that's way before. So if you look at that date thing we're talking about there,
Yes.
that would be while they're in captivity. So what we're talking about is, somewhere after 586 BC, between 586 and 457.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay? Yep. So,
So the only way they could verify the validity of the Dead Sea Scrolls were from the fragments that they've had through the years.
right,
Go. That's the only thing they had.
originally, yeah, it's these fragments, and they were thinking, and so the King James is actually based on these manuscripts that's more around 300 AD. And that's what makes the NIV. The NIV was the first translation to use the Dead Sea Scrolls. And that was one of those big significant steps of the NIV when it was put together during the 60s and then came out in the early 70s. And that's what makes it so much better than the King James.
No, was she walking that way or was
Okay, excuse me again here. I apologize.
Right.
This is important.
Did you find her?
He's out.
How about you could take notes for me? I'll go give the hand.
Okay.
Be back.
Yeah.
Thanks, Joe.
Wow. Oh boy. Okay, well, we'll continue on here and finish this up. So, if you go on to page 4 there at the end. So like we talked about, the creation stories to the flood accounts, they're all transmitted verbally, and we kind of went over that. Beginning after the flood is the earliest time that accounts could have been written down. So you would have transmitted verbally, and perhaps some might have been written down. We don't have it, but it's reasonable to assume that someone would have write something down. The earliest compilation in writing took place under Moses, and that we have from the Jewish tradition, and it's in Scripture itself. It says Moses wrote this down. Now, when it says Moses wrote down, though in Scripture, it says that Moses wrote the law down. Is that the 10 Commandments on through? And obviously Moses didn't write down about his own death. But Jewish tradition says, yeah, he wrote this down, and that was the earliest part in compiling. And it probably would have been more likely in Egyptian, the language that Moses was raised in and understood, and the dominant language of the period that everything was written in. The accounts of the conquest of Canaan and the period of Judges, that part might have been written down, but not until Samuel comes along. And then you're using what we call this Paleo-Hebrew, the Old Hebrew. And in kind of deductive reasoning, the Judges period, they're very fragmented. And it doesn't talk about anyone writing anything down at all, at any time. And in fact, in reading it, go through Judges, and you will see not once does it talk about referring to the law. of Moses or anything of Moses. It's almost kind of like they're a post-apocalyptic Mad Max world where everything's disappeared and they've forgotten. Because that's what they continually forget about God and about what Moses taught them over and over and over again. So it's not until we get to Samuel that we have an indication of things being written down by Samuel. And so that's why we again have from Jewish tradition Samuel compiling this account of Judges. And in Jewish tradition, Joshua and Judges and 1st and 2nd Samuel are attributed to Samuel and the prophet Nathan. And that also accounts for David and Solomon, their reigns. And then after Solomon, the scrolls and accounts go missing until voila, under King Josiah, then we have the book of the law being discovered again. Now, when they're talking about the book of the law, what are they talking about?
First 5 books, I guess.
Well, the Torah,
Torah.
yeah, we call the Torah the book of the law, and it's attributed to 5 books. We don't know whether it was that full account or whether all they were talking about was Leviticus. The law. But anyway, that's the next indication we have. Notice before that time, after Solomon and the dividing of the kings, no one's talking about the law. No one's talking about reading from manuscripts or scrolls or anything. It like gets lost. And it definitely gets lost with the fall of Jerusalem. And we then know, after that destruction, that during the exile, again, by Jewish tradition, scribes rewrote portions to try to recapture what was lost. And then Ezra and Nehemiah, with these scribes working with them, they're the ones attributed to by Jewish tradition of beginning to pull things together. And so they pull things together, but notice that even after they come back from exile, it doesn't become a Jewish state again. They just go from one occupation to another. They're occupied by the Medes, then the Persians, then the Greeks, then kind of a mixture from Egypt, and then by Rome. They have a little period where they revolt and they have a little independence, but it's a pretty tumultuous independence under the Maccabees. So around 200 BC, this king, who's an Egyptian king, okay, he's an Egyptian king. He once, in Alexandria, which was his capital at the time, to have in his library a complete set of Jewish religious writings. And so what he does, since he owns the territory, is he takes 72 Jewish scribes and takes them to Alexandria to write a book. And in there I got a little paragraph. And so they are commissioned to write out all the Jewish religious writings in Scripture, because he wants a copy in his thing. Now, they do this and they put it into Greek. Because after Alexander the Great, the language of the time is Greek. And that becomes what we call the Septuagint, which is 70 in Greek, for the 70 authors. And they pull this all together. And the oldest complete copy, that's not till 300 AD, but we do have fragments of it. And what happens is, with them, they put together a 3-part Hebrew Bible in this Septuagint. And the 3 parts consist of the Torah, and that's the first time the word Torah is used. And that is the first 5 books. Then the Nevi'im, which is the prophets. And they divide the Nevi'im into the former prophets and the latter prophets. The former prophets are Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. There is no 1st and 2nd Samuel, no 1st and 2nd Kings. It's just Samuel and Kings. And the latter prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12. We call them the minor prophets, but they were just all grouped together under the 12. And then the Ketubim, and the Ketubim is just the writings in general. And that's Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Song of Solomon, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, Esther, Daniel, and then Ezra, Nehemiah were 1, and then Chronicles. So that becomes essentially the first canon of what we would call the Old Testament. And the Septuagint is important because of that pulling these all together. Now, originally, when this was done, because it was some Egyptian guy who could really care less about the one true God and everything, the Jews did not really say, yes, we like this, because this is approximately 100 and some years before Christ. So the Jews don't accept it. They have their scrolls, and the scrolls are separate, and it will take the Jews until about 150 years after Christ before they begin to pull it together and agree with the Septuagint, and they adopt it because they can, Greek is a universal language that then they can share throughout the Roman world at the time. And it's from the Septuagint, and why it's so important, it's from the Septuagint that we get our Old Testament. Our Old Testament comes from that. Now, I provided you your own very copy of the great Isaiah scroll from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And you should have gotten it by email, and Gail and Ab and I'll give you guys a copy. Now, if you look at this and say, gee, I'm all confused, which way's up on this side?
I wouldn't know.
All right, so the way that's up, okay, is this. This nice, here, I'll put it. So the area that got a little smudge mark on this side, that goes over here, and the big thing. So on the bottom is your ragged. The bottom part should be ragged, okay? And, okay, so this is what's called the 14th strip. The strip. The Dead Sea Scrolls, they're scrolls, but they're also in scripts. Okay? So, you ever wonder how they know where to stop when they're unrolling a scroll? You know, how do they know where to stop? They unroll the scroll, how do they know to stop there?
Well,
and
because
can
they know
stop
how to
here?
read this little scribbly stuff.
Yeah, I know. Well, people take a look at our things. The way they know is these are actually in strips. So as you unroll it, here's a strip, here's a strip, here's a strip. So this is the 14th strip. Before they had chapters and everything like that on the scrolls, they had strips. And this is the 14th strip, and it has columns 44, 45, and 46. You read from the right to the left. You read from the right to the left. So this is the 44th column, this is the 45th column, this is the 46th column, and in this, I provided you the translation of the 44th column. And you see it's numbered also, and that's the other thing. So this would be line 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so this is the translation by the lines. Now the reason they call it the Great Isaiah Scroll is because it is it's the earliest copy of Isaiah that's 100% complete, that you can read everything. Not one little piece is missing. And that makes it so invaluable. Lots of the Dead Sea Scrolls, they have pieces missing. And here's one of the neat things. So from this scroll to what we have now, there's only a 16-word variation. Only 16 words.
That are different.
Yeah,
Is that what you're
16-word variation, which is incredible.
Wow.
That there is no other text. Even Shakespeare's plays can't do that. There's bigger variations in Shakespeare's plays to modern translations and works than the Great Isaiah Scroll. And those 16-word variations do not change the meaning.
What
Okay?
chapter would this actually be in our Bible today?
Yes, so now what you got to understand is like that so if you look on the right-hand side and you look at the very first Hebrew word there, okay, on the scroll. So look at the very first word there. That one word there, I know you can't, it looks like total gibberish, but that one word there is behold my servant. When it gets translated into English, there's actually 3 words that it would translate into, okay? I just figured you'd like a copy, your very own copy of a portion of it. This is a very important thing because it contains the prophecy about Christ, the suffering servant, which is another reason.
So Isaiah 53.
It is, yes, there you go.
Wow.
So anyway, so now, in our history of the Bible, where I'm taking up to here, is I'm taking you all the way from the beginning of the compilation to the creation of the Septuagint. Okay? Now we are going to go from there, and we're going to now talk into, next week, get into the New Testament, the beginning of the compilation in the earliest parts of the church. Okay?
Yep.
All righty.
And we have to say a prayer for that little girl.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah. And could you turn off the video there?